Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Stockdale, and I am CSG's Director of Legislative Affairs. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you to the Council of State Governments eCademy on the new Congress and administration and what lies ahead. So today we're going to provide an overview of the challenges and the successes of the new presidential administration and the 115th Congress in pursuing their legislative agenda and what lies in the road ahead. Our panelists are going to analyze both what has been accomplished and what has failed and the political dynamics underlying the approach to governing. Just a couple housekeeping items before we begin. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed to you once it is available on the website and our YouTube channel. We obviously welcome questions from the audience, so if at any time you do have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar dialog box, and we will make sure your question is addressed by our speakers. We can also take questions after the presentations. So let's begin our session with an introduction of today's moderator and our two panelists. We have the pleasure today of having Mark Strand, the president of the Congressional Institute, moderate our discussion. The Congressional Institute is a not-for-profit corporation dedicated to helping members of Congress better serve their constituents and helping their constituents better understand the operations of the national legislature. Mark became president of the Congressional Institute in 2007. He is also an adjunct professor of legislative affairs at George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management. He spent nearly 24 years on Capitol Hill in both the House and Senate, most recently serving as the chief of staff to James Talent from Missouri. Before I turn it over to Mark to begin today's discussion, I'd like to introduce our two panelists. Our first panelist is Don Kettle, a professor and former dean at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. Professor Kettle is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Partnership for Public Service, the Volcker Alliance, and the Brookings Institution. He holds a PhD in political science from Yale University. Prior to his appointment at the University of Maryland, he taught at the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University, the University of Virginia, Vanderbilt University, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He appears frequently in national and international media and is the author of many books and monographs. Too many for me to name here. He's a regular columnist for Governing Magazine and has consulted broadly for government organizations at all levels. Notably, he also chaired 2 gubernatorial Blue Ribbon commissions for the Wisconsin state government. Our other panelist is Jeremy Deutsch. He's the chief of staff for the House Republican Conference. As a top aide in the majority party, Jeremy is changing the culture of Congress to open it up to new ideas and technologies. Jeremy works directly for conference chair Kathy McMorris Rogers, the 4th highest leadership position, who was chosen by her colleagues in 2012 with a mandate to help reach out to younger and more diverse audiences. Jeremy has also served as an executive director of the Washington State Republican Party and on political staff for both the Ohio and Washington state legislatures. We're thrilled to have 3 esteemed experts like Mark, Don, and Jeremy joining us, and we know we will benefit from their valuable insights. Mark, pleased to turn it over to you to begin the discussion.
Jeff, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be talking to members of the Council of State Governments. It's been quite a year already, but at least we fixed one problem right up front, and that was the cozy relationship between the press and the executive branch. I think we've taken care of that, and it's one accomplishment right there. But seriously, the noise is loud, but the issues are important, and there's a lot of hard work to do. And many key agenda items are going to have a dramatic impact on state governments, not only their budgets and their programs and policies as well. We'll focus today on health care, tax reform, and infrastructure, and anything else people want to talk about. But I think these are the big issues. There's a lot of work still to do, and the fact that the newspapers tend to be covering something other than the issues should not discourage us, because a lot of work's being done. But rather than talk for a long time, let's turn right over to the professor, and let's get started talking about the issues.
Hello there, and this is Don Kettle here with you, and I'm actually just thrilled to have a chance to be able to talk about these big issues that are focusing on the stuff that is bubbling around on federalism these days. It is just impossible to underestimate what an important and historic moment this is Not only because everybody's suddenly discovering that the things like Twitter and that social media matters, but the basic issues that are bubbling here on the stove, if I could just go to the next slide, please, that are focusing on the debates on Capitol Hill are in many ways unprecedented. And let me also say that it's easy and popular to talk about the fundamental partisan divides that are going on, and that clearly is making it a lot harder to have these debates. But on the other hand, all of what we're about to talk about today, I think we'd be talking about regardless of who is in the White House. How we resolve them, I think, is going to have a lot to do with the way in which the things begin to settle out. But the issues we're talking about, just no matter what was going to happen, simply were not going to go away. And let me start with the big issues that I think are bubbling on the stove and then talk about some of the background. The first is on health reform. If you look to the long-term future, as I'll show in a couple moments, there's just no escaping this as an important role for the states. Health issues are absolutely central, not only for providing health insurance for people, but also for state budgets in the long haul. And at the center of all of this, of course, is Medicaid. Medicaid is now the big monster that is gobbling up larger and larger pieces of state government budgets. And regardless of whether the Democrats or the Republicans had won in 2016, we were going to have a debate about the future of Medicaid. We're having a different kind of form now than we might have, but boy, it is a big and huge and inescapable issue. The second big issue that's out there right now is infrastructure. And this has to do with the fact that we have not only roads and bridges out there that need to be replaced. Every state, every local government is looking at water and sewer systems. Everybody's looking at big things with an enormous amount of money that we're going to need to be able to spend to try to make that right. And we're also, interestingly enough, having a debate over what infrastructure is. I mean, last week during Infrastructure Week, for example, the president was talking about air traffic control. And that, in his mind, is infrastructure as well. So one of the big problems is what is this thing, who's going to benefit from it, and then the overall balance of lending versus spending programs, because the administration has been talking about $1 trillion worth of investment in infrastructure, but the important point that hasn't gotten very much attention is that it's never been talking about spending $1 trillion to be able to pay for infrastructure. Instead, in the new budget, the proposal is for $200 billion of federal spending in the next decade, just $5 billion in the next year, and I focus on, in particular, the idea of direct investment that would be really designed to try to leverage private money. So a large part of the $1 trillion infrastructure is going to have to do with public-private partnerships, which gets into the question of who it is who's going to be interested in trying to make those private investments in public infrastructure. Then there's the big question about the balance overall of cuts elsewhere in the budget. The budget that's just been released has a 13% cut in discretionary spending in the Department of Transportation. So if you put $5 billion in one place but make a 13% cut in Department of Transportation elsewhere, on balance, where do we end up? So this infrastructure thing is one of those big issues that, again, we were going to debate one way or another, but where the big question about what we're going to spend, what we're going to spend it on, and how we're going to spend it is very much up in the air. Then there's tax reform. And the one thing that everybody agrees is the current tax system at the federal level is a mess. Everybody wants to fix it, but the problem is trying to figure out how to do it, how it will affect state and local revenues, because right now, one proposal on the table from the administration is to eliminate most tax deductions, which most people are in favor of, except, of course, the people who are taking advantage of them. The deductions that the administration is proposing to keep have to do with home ownership and charitable deductions, but what does this have to do with the program for infrastructure, which relies on tax breaks to be able to pay for the investments that the administration wants to make? So the balance of trying to figure out how you do reform on the one side and tax simplification and infrastructure investment on the other is something that is going to be a very tough thing to try to work out. But let me give a little bit of background on all this if I could, and if I could have the next slide, please. If you look over federal grants as a percentage of federal outlays over the last generation or so, there's an interesting story here. From the 1960s to the 70s and the 1980s, federal grants gradually increased as a share of the federal budget, but at that point, it really began to level off, and it's been fairly steady since the 1980s. In many ways, in fact, the high watermark of federal aid to state and local governments was about 1970 to 1980, and since then it's been a fairly flat share of the federal budget. What this really suggests, given all the pressures for defense spending and for entitlements, is that it's very hard to think that there's going to be a big increase in federal grants to state and local governments no matter what happens, because that simply is the way that history was speaking, and it's the way that history was going to work out no matter what and no matter who was elected. But, and if I could go to the next slide, one of the things, too, that if you look at this is that we really have, the last generation, a tale of two different eras. For the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, we had a gradual increase in spending, in part through the Great Society of the 60s, but then through block grants in the 70s and 80s, and that was responsible for driving the federal spending for federal grants up. But then enthusiasm for block grants went down, Medicaid spending went up, and so as we look at the way in which federal spending and different kinds of strategies for grants has changed over time, what we really have is a dramatic reversal in the way in which federal grants are being spent, from the investment in block grants on the one side to health care on the other. And the next slide makes that point, I think, even more clearly. You look at this slide, what's fascinating here is that if you look at particularly federal grants for physical capital, and that's really federal grants for infrastructure, since 1960, the amount has tripled after you account for inflation. So that's not a insignificant increase. But payments for individuals, and that's mainly welfare, but especially Medicaid, that has increased by 32 times. And grants for health programs alone, and this is mainly Medicaid, now amount to almost 2/3 of all federal aid. So that the overall story of federal grants to state and local governments over the last generation has been that Medicaid in particular has been the big monster that's crowded out almost everything else. So if you really want to understand the overall thrust of what's happening with federal grants, with federal relationships on the financial side with state and local governments, it's really the story of Medicaid. And that is the thing more than anything else we need to look at. The next slide shows that we're going to be doing this for a very long time. This is from the Federal Government Accountability Office, and it shows a couple things. The first is that right now, in general, state and local government operating balances are in deficit, and it's no surprise that with the big economic collapse in 2008 and 2009, that state and local governments are struggling. But what this also suggests is that absent some kind of major change, and this is the basis of GAO's projections, absent some major change, that in situation that we see now is going to continue for the next two generations until at least until at least 2060 here. So what this says is that not only have we seen a dramatic change in federal aid to state and local governments through the rise of Medicaid, but that fiscal stress on state and local governments is not likely to get better, and that the stress is going to continue as health care for Medicaid for state government recipients and Medicaid for those who receive aid through state governments, and that employee benefits for health care are going to continue to create ongoing fiscal stress on state governments. So not to be too depressing about this, but the fact is that no matter how you slice it, the central issue facing state government budgets and the central issue facing the federal financial relationship with state and local governments has to do with health care, has to do with Medicaid, and has to do with how much of the federal budget is actually now being spent to try to help subsidize medical assistance in the states, and how much of the states are now spending a lot of their budgets to try to take account of that. And there's no sign that that is going to change anytime soon at all. The last piece has to do with the next slide, please, has to do with the aging population. And if you look at all this, the thrust of this is that the population is getting older. I'm a proud carrier right now of a Medicare card, which I just got for myself, and it is in my back pocket right now. But I love to tell my students, you know what, I am your worst nightmare, because I'm in a situation right now where I and all the other people who are baby boomers are nearing retirement. There are going to be a lot more of us, as you see from these projections. Not only that, but we're going to be living longer. And so the federal government's biggest problem right now, state government's biggest problem, local government's biggest problem is going to be taking care of us and the amount of strain that we are going to be putting on federal, state, and local government budgets through health care, through medical assistance, and then also, of course, through Medicare and other programs as well. So that in many ways, the big issue facing federal, state, and local governments, but the core of the financial relationship comes down most basically and most fundamentally to the fact that it is, and my apologies for the background noise here, I'm at a spot where I had a choice between either a decent internet connection or quiet, and so I had to go for internet. We got a little bit more quiet here. The basic story, no matter what it is that you to look at, is that medical costs are going up. They're crowding out other forms of federal aid to state and local governments. They are the big overhang on state budgets, will be for a very long time, and any kind of fix of any kind, one way or another, has got to try to find a way to solve that problem. Now, that means that as we get back to infrastructure, infrastructure has to be seen in the context of how much money is going to be left, has to be seen in the context of what infrastructure is. It has to be done in trying to figure out how we squeeze out cash for doing this at a time when there's not a lot of cash. And it has to do with the fundamentals of trying to think about tax reform, because one way or another, the infrastructure pieces, since they rely so heavily on borrowing programs, also rely on portions of and provisions of the tax code that one way or another have to be set up to encourage these kinds of investments as well. As I said, these are the proposals that the administration is making. My guess is that if the Democrats had won in 2016, one way or another, we'd be having exactly the same conversations because exactly the same realities would have been taking place. So there are a lot of possibilities out there that we can talk about in the course of the debate, but the basic realities are there. They're not going to change, and they're going to demand some of the most clever policy initiatives we could possibly imagine. And that's something that I'm going to be looking forward to talking with all of you much more about. So let me stop at this point and hand the microphone back.
Well, great. Thank you, Professor. I think you got your charts from the Book of Revelations, but you know, now you know why I started off with a joke, because we're all depressed here. But let me turn it over to Jeremy Deutsch of the House Republican Conference.
Well, thank you, Mark, and I'm glad I get to follow the professor on that positive, upbeat picture that he painted for all of us in our work ahead. I think somebody said it's happy hour somewhere, even though it's only 2 o'clock on the East Coast. And all joking aside, let me just thank CSG and Jeff for putting this forum together. As Jeff had mentioned, I worked in the Ohio legislature and the Washington state legislature, both in the Ohio Senate and the Ohio State House. And way back when I worked in the legislature, I worked very closely with CSG and familiar with the wonderful work that you all do, and obviously an honor too to be on a panel with Dr. Kettle, who insists that I call him Don, who's obviously very distinguished, and a great overview and presentation, as sobering as it is. I think you hit on a lot of important points. And obviously to our moderator, Mark Strand, who I've worked very closely with over the last decade, and is just a tremendous partner for the House Republican leadership team, the House Republican Conference, and, you know, time permitting, there's been a lot of fun things we've been doing on a bipartisan case and events, which really doesn't get covered much in the news. Having said all that, I was asked mainly to come here to kind of paint an insider's perspective, if you will, on the different issues that we're facing, how we're tackling them, the challenges. I take issue with Jeff and his comment. I think he wanted me to address, Jeff, the failures of this Congress. There are no failures. We're making Congress great again. And we're excited about the accomplishments and what we have done thus far. Always very dangerous to start off with statistics. I think Mark Twain once said there's 3 types of lies in America: lies, damn lies, and statistics. And I apologize that this one slide is out of order a little bit, but this is one way to measure productivity that you've seen our leadership team talk about a lot, mainly the Republican leader out of California, Mr. McCarthy, looking at both how many bills the House has passed and how many laws have been signed in to date. The first slide just simply shows that thus far we've had 37 different pieces of legislation that have been signed into law. If you compare the same time with the Obama administration at this point, he had 24. And I'll note that's also 24 with 60 seats in the Senate. Obviously, we don't have 60, and that's a tough number to get to. But again, 37 to 24, respectively. President Bush at 15 and Clinton and H.W. Bush at 35 and 33. The next slide, and that you'll see again, this just shows how many bills were passed. Again, 158 to 131, and 37 that have been signed into law. The next slide just generally speaks about what our goals here are of the House Republicans and our legislative agenda, and then I can go specifically into a little bit more accomplishments as well. But this should be no surprise to anyone. Obviously, we're coming from a perspective of, you know, less federal government, more state and local control. You know, we have an 10th Amendment caucus, if you will, constantly looking at different ways where we can empower the state governments and return more authority and more things back to the states. Also trying to get away from the agencies and the rulemaking of the agencies, and, you know, what I think a lot of our members would say, the bureaucrats that are making all these different decisions and regulations without having the people's voice at the table. And my boss has been a really big advocate of, and I think we talked earlier about, unauthorized spending, unauthorized agencies, but also, you know, how we restore the people's voice back to Article 1. And she's both critical of the times when, you know, the Republicans were in charge with the Republican administration, and also with the Obama administration, and where, again, too much of the decision making is done at the agency and department level, and not enough being done at the congressional level. And then obviously, you know, that ties into federal intervention. The Democrats, more federal government, bigger government. That is obviously a criticism that you'll hear from our side of the aisle. More deference to the agencies versus Congress. And I think they're doing an exceptional job of protecting the Obama legacy items. I've used this analogy before, and it hasn't really gone. I don't think anybody gets it, but I remember watching Rocky, and, you know, Rocky 1, and he's like in the ring, and he's getting ready, and sure enough, like Apollo comes in, and Rocky has this quote. He's like, "Oh darn, I hope he wasn't showing up." And of course, Apollo shows up, and to think for a second that the Democrats on the other side are not going to push back on a lot of the Obama legacy items, whether it be, you know, healthcare or most recently on Dodd-Frank. They're definitely engaged, fired up. I think you've seen it from a political perspective. If you watch closely to any of the special elections, I don't know if we have people from Montana on the line or not, but certainly that was an election that was a lot closer than it should have been. If you looked at places, Georgia is on June 20th. You know, it's going to be, it's a razor-thin election there. You're seeing 47-47 in the Survey USA poll that came out today. And a big part of that is you see the intensity on the Democrat side being very engaged and a higher intensity in turning out, and less so on the Republican side. Also say, you know, that all of our members are saying, and especially us from Washington State, the different types of sit-ins, the protests in these congressional offices, again, My boss was the only member from Washington State, the Republican member, to vote for the repeal and replace bill that we had up earlier last month. And you know, there's protesters out there, and they're vocal, and they're showing up, and they're engaging in a lot of different ways. And that's just a reality type thing that I wanted to point out, especially when it comes to those that are protecting President Obama's legacy. The next slide, which will pop up here in a second, are just some of the different accomplishments. While that slide's coming up, we had a CR that had expired right on April 30th. We got our first funding bill through. I think there were a lot of accomplishments that pointed to some of the Trump agenda. When you looked at specifically increasing military spending, this was the largest pay raise that we gave to our military men and women in the last 6 years. More additional money to combat ISIS. There was no money in there specifically for the wall and the border wall. And again, this was, look, at the end of the day, I think, I'm talking a little out of order here, House Republicans are going to be probably evaluated based on what President Trump campaigned on. And a big part of that was building the wall. Another part of it is repeal and replace on health care. Certainly tax reform will be another area that will be evaluated on. And then I think to a lesser extent, but also front and center, will be infrastructure. Our last spending bill didn't have any money in there for the wall, but it did provide over $12 million for enhanced and increased border protection with customs. The IRS is an area in the EPA and other departments that we cut different type of funding for them as well. There's been some provisions in there to protect life, which is very important to the pro-life caucus in our conference, crime as well. And a big thing that I think is where there'll be a lot of bipartisan traction too is combating opioids and the addiction and the horrible issues that have been going on there. I think in the piece of legislation, we had over $650 million to address that too. So funding in that bill, I think, pardon me, if you can go back to the previous slide. I think that was one of the accomplishments, and we had to do that in a bipartisan fashion and manner. The House, on healthcare reform, the professor talked a lot about, obviously, Medicaid. We believe we kept our core principles and what the president and others campaigned on covering pre-existing conditions, the 26 and younger provision in the individual mandates. Also provided a lot of flexibility to the states, which we can go into further details too, on providing more flexibility, whether it be work requirements, the MacArthur amendment, the $138 billion for the Patient State Stability Fund, which helps those with pre-existing conditions, giving more flexibility for the states on the essential health benefits. And I know in Q&A, if that's an area that we want to spend more time on, we can definitely talk about that. But the big question is, what happens to healthcare? Where do we go? You know, informally, the Senate leaders, well, formally met with the president yesterday. We were with a few senators yesterday as well. They've had productive conversations and meetings. They look to potentially, I wouldn't write this in stone, but have something out of the Senate before the 4th of July recess. It comes, you know, back here to the House. Hopefully we're able to reconcile the differences. We can go back on an August recess with one of the major items, healthcare, taken care of. That would be, you know, the goal of, I think, the House Republicans and you know, Senate Republicans and the president. I think we learned a lot from that lesson too, as far as, and you'll see this in tax reform, kind of coming together, trying to get all of us on the same sheet of music. The Senate, you know, I think Speaker Foley, who was from Eastern Washington, once said that in the House, our opposition, and he was a Democrat, said, our opposition is the Republicans, but our enemy is the Senate. And, you know, trying to get 100 people, or, you know, heck, even a majority in the Senate on the same page, where I think everybody over there thinks they should be president of the United States, is no easy task. But we've been opening up those lines, and I think you're going to see kind of a more unified effort on tax reform. On the Congressional Review Act, which I have a slide on this on the next slide, this was, again, a law that was passed in '96. It allows Congress to veto the agency rulemaking. You heard me talk about that in the beginning of the presentation. Essentially, if Congress disapproves a rule over a certain threshold of a dollar amount impact, I believe, we're able to get involved. It was only used once It was only used successfully once in 2001. I think they tried to use it 4 other times under Obama, and he vetoed it. One time in 2001, and that was on an ergonomics rule. We've been able to use this 14 times now. So obviously a record on things from education, drug testing, wildlife, securities, energy production, telecommunications. The list goes on and on. So I think that's another area where we've had some accomplishments. And real quick, I think Jeff used the word failure maybe, or I'd like to say maybe obstacles to some of our successes, which I show on the next slide. And as that's pulling up, I think you probably have heard reports. There's a diversity of opinions within the House Republican Conference. You know, you have some folks in the Freedom Caucus, which are, you know, if you read reports, 30 to 40 members who I think the press would paint them one way. There's actually reasonable members in the Freedom Caucus that you can work with, but there's a group there that have you know, made governing for the leadership difficult. You have you know, the more moderate group called the Tuesday Group, which is another caucus. Then you have the traditional kind of, if you would say, the RSC. Then you have establishment. So it's kind of a unique group of members in the House Republican Conference, which it's, I think Speaker Boehner once said, you know, it's a wheelbarrow full of frogs, and you're trying to keep all the frogs in the wheelbarrow. And you know, we see that pop up, and certainly there's going to be a lot of big issues where that's going to come into play. I talked earlier about, you know, just the partisan politics, and I think fair to say that the Democrats are very engaged and fired up. And with that, there's also a lot of unique opportunities, I think. My boss back home has been hosting a series of unity dinners, bringing Democrats and Republicans together and people of diverse and different backgrounds to talk about issues and, you know, do it over a meal setting. And this is something that she's actually started here on the House side, and mainly focusing on women, Democrats, and Republicans coming together and seeing if there's ways in certain areas that we may actually work together while there's all this kind of clutter going on in distractions. And I know the Congressional Institute has been doing this also on a House-Senate area as well. So I think there's a lot of unique opportunities, a lot of challenges. I'm sorry, I probably went on a little bit too long, but would love to take any questions or provide a little bit more color if that's helpful.
Well, okay, this is really 2 great presentations. Thank you, both you gentlemen. So let's now hit these some of these tough questions pretty quickly and get different perspectives. One of the things we know is that the exchanges are in trouble in states across the country, that even if the House and the Senate does nothing, that we have the states have a major problem with health care coming up. You know, initially everyone said the states weren't going to, the Senate wasn't going to act, but they seem to be getting closer to an act. Professor, what do you think is the solution on Medicaid? How can the House and Senate reconcile their positions on Medicaid funding? That's
literally the gazillion-dollar question here. And 2 quick points in trying to answer that. The first is that the hidden secret about the healthcare debate, especially on the Affordable Care Act and its replacement, is that, like it or not, one way or another, it's all really a question of federalism. The states are the front lines where this is going to work itself out, and that's something that's largely missing from the way in which here inside the Beltway the issue is so often debated. So the first point is that health reform has to be understood as a question of federalism. The second is that this is about insurance, and insurance is about trying to take care of uncertainty. We understand that what people try to do is to buy insurance to protect themselves from things they don't know are going to happen, but on the other hand, insurance companies don't want too much uncertainty because then they don't know how to write their policies or whether or not they want to write policies at all. And so what that really says is that the solution has to lie first on trying to provide greater certainty underneath the system. The second is that the fix has got to be an intergovernmental one with the states as major players and having major roles, and the federal government third trying to decide which bits of coverage that it wants to try to guarantee and provide for everybody. But the question of certainty cannot be underestimated. The insurance companies really want to know what kind of business they're in and how stable their markets are going to be, and they're simply just not going to play ball if it turns out that they don't know what game they're playing. And so those are the key solutions to begin with. It relies for solutions how? First, in trying to figure out what are the basics that we're going to guarantee to everybody. Is Congress interested in trying to talk about pre-existing conditions and care up to age 26, for example? How much flexibility will the states going to have? How much, secondly, will the federal government provide in terms of support for those who can't afford coverage, and what kind of support are they going to provide to the states? And then third, most importantly, for the insurance companies is how much certainty can they have around the markets that are going to be created? Those are the big flashpoints, and if we can get some solution on those, then I think we've got the foundations for some kind of success on this. And this is one of those things, for better or worse, that we're going to have to confront whether Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump was elected president.
Great. One of the things, obviously, that we're looking at is, and the pre-existing conditions. The House bill shifted money away from having the policyholders pay for the higher bills, which was, of course, driving the insurance companies out, and then shifting it to the state pools where they would help cover some of the people with pre-existing conditions. But Jeremy, what do you think of the solution is, and is this something that the House and Senate are going to be able to work out? I think one of the things people really need to know in state governments is this going to happen? And how do you see this finishing out over the next month or so?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I think, on a regular basis, on a daily basis, the House and Senate, the leadership teams at the staff level, and the White House have been working together to, focus on the common ground areas and the principles that we see fit. And I think when you look at a principle that we don't want to kick anybody off of healthcare, we want to preserve and protect the most vulnerable individuals, and keeping in mind we want to keep the states in control and give them the flexibility to innovate. And also, I think if you've looked at the Patient State Stability Fund, the additional $138 billion there to protect those with pre-existing conditions, lowers the cost of those with pre-existing conditions. I think these are all the areas that we're going to continue to hammer away. We've had great leadership meetings. We're working together, hammering these things out, and I'm very encouraged by.
So, gentlemen, your predictions: will we have a health care bill by Labor Day, that's signed by the president?
Yes.
Professor?
I think no. I think we're a little ways away from being able to get that happen. I think the Senate's going to try very hard, but the idea of a signing ceremony by the 4th of July seems like a pretty far reach. But I'd be surprised.
Yes.
Well, Professor, I'm sorry, you said no by Labor Day?
By Labor Day, I just not by the 4th of July for starters. Labor Day, I think, is a stretch. And so I'm so weaseling on this. I think it's possible that something may pass, but if it passes, let me make this prediction. Anything that passes by Labor Day will leave enough questions unasked and unanswered that we're going to have to come back at it again.
Yeah, I think this issue, healthcare is never going to go away as an issue, but that'll be interesting. Let's switch to tax reform and talk about that. Obviously, there's the Better Way plan that Ryan and Brady have been pushing with the border adjustment, but also it does wipe out the deduction for state and local taxes and many other tax breaks, developmental tax breaks that people are getting. The president issued a plan that he does not do a border adjustment. He does not switch to a cash flow tax system like the House does, but he does get rid of a lot of the deductions in order to lower the rates. Yeah, so we have these two plans on the table, and part of my question, we haven't had real tax reform since 1986. Is there going to be a Bradley and a Gephardt this year to step up for the Democrats and make a proposal? Jeremy, let's start with you this time.
Well, and I'll point out that in 1986, the genesis of that tax reform was done at a pub called the Irish Times. If you recall, Senator Packwood, who was chairing the, Mark, this is before your time. You're not that old.
No, actually, I've been working.
You were years. Oh, okay. He made some type of, and Senator Packwood told me the story, made some type of presentation before the Joint Tax Committee. They kicked him out, and he and his chief of staff, I think, went to the Dubliner or the Irish Times, drank 2 pitchers of beer, and on the back of a bar napkin laid out the framework for the 1986 tax reform. The president doesn't drink. That's the good news. And I think we can come up with a better tax reform proposal and not have to drink 2 pitchers of beer first to lay the framework. I think as I mentioned earlier, I think we've learned a lot of lessons on healthcare. Since our House and Senate joint retreat in January that the Congressional Institute sponsored, we have been talking about tax reform. We've been talking about tax reform after the election, really trying to get, there's a diversity of opinions here. Yes, in the House, the Speaker and the Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, obviously there's the border adjustment tax, which is something that they're looking at very closely. I think there was a statement today by Chairman Brady talking about phasing in the border adjustment tax in a 5-year period. The White House is, and I think there's a diversity of opinions in the White House about some proposals there, even on certain taxes, temporary and permanent, Mnuchin, Khan, and others. They're still working on that, and certainly the Senate. But before I think you see anything formally rolled out, there's going to be more of a kind of unified approach, and something that I think we can all together on, and again, find the common consensus and move forward.
Professor, everyone talks about, even President Obama thought the corporate tax code needed to be reformed, but obviously one of the big issues for big states as opposed to small states is the deductibility of state taxes. Because it obviously would put a lot of pressure on states with higher tax rates than the other ones. Is this something that just the states just can't afford right now, or is it a market distortion that should have been corrected years ago? I mean, what do you make of that?
The core problem here is that there are so many states that are so heavily dependent on the deduction that whether in principle it would be better to back away from that or not, the politics and the finances, I think at this point, make it impossible. And that's for Republicans and Democrats alike. The hit on state budgets that are already in serious trouble would be so serious that it's hard to imagine this going through, even though, as a matter of principle...
You think they would have lower rates? And then?
I just don't think that the idea of a switch for doing away with lower federal rates in exchange for fewer tax deductions is ever going to pass at this point, even though the bottom line is we spend more money in tax deductions and credits than we do on the entire discretionary part of the federal budget. Now, let me just repeat that. We spend more money on tax breaks than we do on the discretionary portion of the federal budget. That part of the budget is out of control. But especially when it comes to state and local governments, the hit would be so severe that it's very hard to imagine this going through. And to add one other point, it's just impossible for the administration to pursue its infrastructure plan, which relies very heavily on tax credits for investments in infrastructure, and at the same time to remove tax credits and deductions to simplify the tax code on the other. It's just impossible to do both simultaneously. And so I think we're at the point where I'm afraid, even though I would love to see this, that I think we have so many roadblocks in its way, it's frankly pretty hard to see this happening.
And I think the political reality of the situation is 2017 is our year. Things are going to get a lot tougher in 2018. 2017 is going to be an easier year for us, as difficult as it may be, and that's where I'm very bullish on healthcare by the August recess and tax reform, or some version of tax reform by the end of the year, is I think what 2017 is going to look like.
Good. One last question on tax reform before we get to infrastructure is that the whole idea of a border adjustment has been talked about in the House plan, and while some people in the White House have opposed it, a lot of the benefit to that is that it creates no advantage for corporations to move their companies overseas, and it might actually encourage foreign investment. It wouldn't really change the trade deficit, but would include more foreign investment in states like what South Carolina's done, where it would be cheaper for foreign companies to produce their goods here and sell them. Is this something that the states should be interested in, or is it something that the changes are, again, Professor indicated, the changes too dramatic for the states to handle at this point, given the fragile finances?
I think both the implications for state budgets are pretty substantial, so it's going to be hard for states to put their arms around this. And this is, I think, in the end, more likely to be a kind of inside the beltway, inside the Capitol kind of battle over the nature of tax reform itself. It's likely to be a Republican versus Democrat, in some cases Republican versus Democrat, Republican versus Republican battle, than it is to be a fundamental question the states are likely to have to be drawn into, I suspect.
Excellent point. All right, one of the big things about infrastructure, obviously, is that kind of the way they set up this reconciliation process is to get to infrastructure, you have to pass tax reform. To get to tax reform, you have to pass healthcare reform, which was probably in the reverse order of popularity. But one of the key things about the tax reform bill is creating a one-time deduction for corporations to be able to repatriate some of the $2 trillion they have overseas to start a seed money for an infrastructure investment program. Jeremy, what do you hear from leadership about infrastructure coming down the pike?
Well, obviously, this is going to be another top priority. The big question is, and what we're still trying to reconcile is how you do pay for it. The president has talked about a very ambitious infrastructure program, spending, close to $1 trillion. And I think shortly after the president was sworn in and had some friends down at the Oval Office for the NASA reauthorization bill signing, and he was complaining to the space guys, look, I'm spending all this money in space, but I have roads and bridges and an infrastructure problem here where we need to be spending money on our infrastructure program. So the president's also a builder, he's a developer, and this is something that he's super passionate about. Last week was a focus on infrastructure and coordinating as much as we can on the president's message and getting a message out. I think, they had multiple events starting off the week with Schuster and ending with the Secretary of Transportation. But again, the point that you brought, maybe overseas $2 trillion, how do we get that money back in here to help pay for infrastructure is certainly something that we're all looking at. We're public-private partnerships, looking at all the different types of options that we may be able to pay for a very robust infrastructure program. That's exactly why I think, tackling tax reform, seeing what type of revenue we can get there, additional savings with other types of programs and efficiencies to build doors. I also think that this is a unique opportunity for us to work in a bipartisan way. And certainly there's some private conversations that have been going on with Democrats where they're very interested in different infrastructure programs and projects in inner cities and other places where this could be something we work on. Clearly, we wanted to move healthcare first because we knew that would be more partisan. Tax reform, let things kind of fall out a little bit, work on infrastructure, and try to lock in what we can before we get into a busy campaign season in 2018.
How's that going? Oh, never mind. That's rhetorical. Professor, no, if they get through the tough one, I think the next two are much easier once you get to that. But Professor, obviously the infrastructure is a major problem for the states. They are struggling to come up with ways to improve some, badly damaged, bridges and roads that are badly need repair. With this approach, the president's talking about work. Is it, is this something that? How do you think the states are going to react to this? And in your opinion, can this finally be the first bipartisan initiative in the Congress?
The states are wildly enthusiastic about infrastructure, and it is, as Jeremy pointed out, one of the great opportunities for a reach across the aisle. Every single state everywhere needs more infrastructure, and that's not just roads and bridges and water and sewer, but it has to do with high-speed internet and a whole collection of things that help the states get ready for the 21st century economy. And so this is one of those true opportunities that are sitting out there waiting for a bipartisan agreement. The challenges, as Jeremy pointed out, is how to pay for it, and there basically are two options. One is that the federal government provides cash for state and local investment, and the administration in the budget has put up about $5 billion in the next fiscal year, and that, if you just take care of some of the problems inside New York City, you can't even cross the Hudson with the amount of money that would be providing. They're just, the needs are so enormous. The larger piece of this that we're talking about, the $1 trillion, really relies very heavily on tax breaks. And these are very complicated arrangements that first require you to decide that you're going to use the tax code for a policy, which is hard to do at the same time you're talking about simplifying it. So you've got to wrap your head around that. Then you've got to ask what kinds of projects are most likely to be funded. And it's a lot easier to raise private investment through these tax breaks for new airports and tollways than, for example, to put infrastructure into rural areas. And so the paradox here is that the projects that are most easy to raise money for in public-private partnerships are more likely to be in Democratic areas, and the Republican areas that need some of this infrastructure investment may find the hardest time attracting it. So there's a real partisan problem in all of this. And then ultimately there's the problem of trying to figure out how you structure these things in a way that makes sense over the long haul and how you govern them. It turns out these are very, very complicated deals. And so the paradox here is that the easiest thing on which to get agreement, that is to invest in infrastructure, may be one of the very hardest to pull off. But there still are opportunities here, both through some direct investment and through some targeted tax breaks to be able to put something together. So there is an infrastructure deal here on the table to be had, I think.
I think you're right. I think it's one of the attractions of the repatriation tax break because it does put a lot of money up front, but you're right, it's an enormously complex issue, but badly needed. One of the issues related to infrastructure and roads is the restoration of earmarks. A lot of states used to spend time lobbying Congress for individual projects they thought a big need. The county and local governments have definitely used to lobby. Do you guys see earmarks reform coming down the pike as a way to, one, make legislators a little bit more responsive to their local needs, and two, perhaps greasing the wheels of bipartisanship? Don't both answer at once.
This is Don. I'm happy to take a stab at that one. And we of course did away with earmarks because everybody saw it as a waste of money and as a way to try to just grease the wheels behind the scenes in a way that wasn't transparent and that tended to be a waste of federal money. And boy, do I wish we could bring them back. I think not for two reasons. One is that even if it costs $25 billion a year, say, in programs that maybe didn't have the broadest support, it'd be worth it to try to make the process work again. If we could just get the budget passed on time and it costs us $25 billion in earmarks, it'd be worth every single penny of that. But on the other hand, it would also be worthwhile to get bipartisan agreement on the need to try to bring government back to the ground for roads and bridges and the kinds of things that states and cities do all the time. So I'm a huge fan of actually bringing earmarks back, and not so sure it's going to happen in this environment, but I think it'd be nice if it did. It's one of those, boy, I wish we could do it if we could.
All right. One of the key things that I guess would make a more transparent earmark process would be restoring the authorization process. And the rumors now of doing one giant omnibus before we get to the end of the year. But one of the big shames of that is that the authorization process doesn't take place where governors and state legislators and county come up and testify to their states. Is there any hope to repair this? The biggest problem with the budget here is that 90% of the members were not here the last time it worked on schedule and on time. But the authorization process, real oversight takes place, and where the states that have the greatest impact on the legislative process. Jeremy, what do you think?
Yeah, this is something that my boss is very passionate about. I encourage people to take a look at the her act and her bill. It's called the Unauthorized Spending Act, creatively named the USA Act. And this is where we get back to fixing a broken appropriations process. And for far too long, we have too many departments, agencies, other programs that have been going unauthorized. And, we've been providing these waivers to allow funding for these different departments. I believe the last time, for example, the VA was authorized was 1996. And, when you have the authorizers, when you have the committees doing their work, holding these hearings, hearing from folks back home, whether it's state reps, state senators, governors, it is so darn helpful where we can identify these different types of problems. Because the problem is, problems are identified when it spills over. And, I think if things were authorized like the VA, the wait list, the wait times, the lack of innovation, efficiency, you name it, would have been identified long before the New York Times broke some type of story. It's like the best way to help keep these departments and these agencies and Congress working together and exercising their authority. We very seriously take our, appropriating responsibilities, Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, on spending. The USA Act will enhance oversight and accountability and bring government closer to the people, which is exactly what we need.
Yeah, I think obviously the State Council of Governments does a great job representing their members here, but it's pretty hard for states to access the process when all they can lobby on is one giant, massive omnibus bill drawn up at midnight. Professor, any thoughts on that? And then I guess we sort of have to move to close. But
yeah, but I will tell you, I'm enthusiastically behind trying to get the budget back on track again. We've just simply forgotten how to budget carefully and how to try to have careful discussions over how to spend our money. It just is absolutely unforgivable, I think, for democracy. And we've become the global leader in budget dysfunction, and that's not any place where we want to be, I don't think. So getting back to a regular authorization process, getting back to regular appropriations, getting back to debates about the things that matter with oversight that is focused on what it is we're actually doing well, doing it on time, and getting the people's business done is simply an absolute bottom line for being able to get this thing rolling again. And rolling all of our spending decisions into quick omnibus decisions, passed late in one big chunk that nobody can look at is simply no way to run an effective federal government, I don't think.
I would just say, Congress is operating under the 1974 Budget Act. Innovation and technology is something we're very excited about here. Would Apple have been able to invent the iPhone if they worked on the 1974 operating system? And the answer is no. And when you look at the 1974 Budget Act and you look at how many times Congress has passed a budget and went through the whole entire appropriations process. So 1974 to 2017, how many times have we passed a budget and fully appropriated the government? You know what the answer is, Mark?
I'm afraid I do, Jeremy, but tell us anyway.
Four.
4 times. Man.
4 times. And in that period, I think there have been 20 government shutdowns. So, this is something that Speaker Ryan is very passionate about. He's a former budget chairman, and obviously my boss and the USA Act, and something that definitely needs to get modernized because this system of budgeting and appropriating is not working.
Great. Did you guys, I didn't know if anyone had sent any questions in. Do you know that? If not, let's sum it up. Professor, any final thoughts about it's going to be a tough year, but maybe it could be a pretty productive year too?
Well, it's a tough year. It has the opportunity to be a productive year. As I suggested earlier, a lot of the big, fierce battles we're fighting, we were going to have to fight one way or another anyway. And so it's important to have a good debate over what it is we're doing. The one point that I would end with is that to a much larger degree than I think is often recognized, certainly in Washington, so many of these issues have to do with the states and have to do with federalism. And that, I think, is something fundamental that we need to try to grapple with. And the states have to be brought in as partners to this, because one way or another, they're going to be responsible for producing the results.
Great. Jeremy?
Yeah, I agree. And we've been working with the states on these different types of reforms, and I think it's important to build on that partnership. Look, this is a fun and interesting and unique time. Some say we haven't seen an administration like this since 1828 and Andrew Jackson. I would say, because they say, well, he wasn't part of the establishment. Actually, Andrew Jackson was a member of Congress. I think we've actually elected somebody who is more anti-establishment than perhaps all the way back to 1828. It's a historical time. It's a unique time. And, you know, I joke, well, I always mention my mom, but I joke around with my mom sometimes. I say, you know, if only the president said, let's make America good again, you know, that would have been a lot easier. America. And I know you can't see me, but I don't have any hair left anymore, and I'm completely bald. But we're definitely we're having fun while we serve too, and a lot of unique time to really change and transform government.
Well, thank you to Professor Don Kettle and to Jeremy Deutsch of the House Republican Conference. You know, while the world's news media seems to be gathered around the Senate Intelligence Committee room, real work does seem to be getting done, but it's an important time, and I think where the hope is that we can do some major accomplishments this year. I mean, and after all this conflict, I mean, I don't know how many times in the last administration the state government sued the executive branch. Perhaps we may be going back towards a better balance between Congress and the executive, between the states and the executive. We'll see. There's a lot left to happen, but we certainly could keep talking about these issues for hours upon hours. But Jeff, I think our time is up.
That is right. Thank you, Mark. Wow, you all left us certainly with some big things to think about. Those were fantastic presentations. So on behalf of CSG, thank you to Don and Jeremy and Mark. And also thank you to our audience for tuning in to today's session. As I mentioned during the introduction, the webinar will be archived on CSG's website and available for future use and reference. So on behalf of CSG, thank you again for joining us, and please contact us if you have any questions. And thanks again to our panel. We hope you can join us again next time. I hope everybody has a great day.